The usual spiel, as you probably know, GGH is a long-standing partnership with the Teton County Library and the Library Foundation. We are very grateful to the library for allowing us to use this wonderful space. So please remember them in your giving plans. Also, GGH programs are part of the Science and Nature Tuesday evening programs that take place here in the library on the first and second Tuesdays of the month. The next program I'd like to announce is actually next year already, I know. January 2024, it will be on Thursday because the Tuesday is too close to the first of the year. So it'll be on Thursday, January 4th here at the library, of course. And we are delighted to have Mike Adler speak to us again, and his lecture will be titled Journey to the Sun. And I'm sure this will be fascinating. All right, on to tonight's program. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Shannon Nawotniak. I hope I said that right.
Good enough. It is not pronounceable or phonetic. It's a real treat.
Who is professor in the Department of Geosciences and director of the University Honors Program at Idaho State University. As a volcanologist, her work spans investigating volcanic hazards from explosive events to using lava flows to understand the history of Mars and the Moon. Her work includes field campaigns, laboratory analyses, and computational modeling. She is a member of the INL's Probabilistic Volcanic Hazard Assessment Science Leadership Team and a member of the Science Operations Team for an upcoming lunar robotic mission. And last fall, she served at Johnson Space Center's Mission Control on NASA's simulation team, preparing for the Artemis 3 crewed mission to the lunar South Pole. She has served on the leadership of 2 different multinational teams that have been awarded the NASA Ames Research Center Awards for Excellence. She has been awarded over $2.7 million in research funding and has 33 peer-reviewed publications. Probably her favorite brag, however, is that she was once paid to ride a horse up a volcano through the rainforest with a machete. Love it. Okay, welcome, Shannon.
Thank you. I'm set to be taking over as department chair in geosciences next year. May any of my faculty meetings be as efficient as your guys' business meeting just was. That was phenomenal. All right, let me get my screen back sorted. There we go. And yeah, we'll need to dim the lights a bit because I will have some pictures coming up that are going to be fairly dark, and we'll need to have some dimness to be able to see them. It is my pleasure to be back here speaking to you guys. It's been a good long minute. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. I mean, I can go full Professor Bello if necessary. You just tell me. Like, we teach outside, we can make it loud. I need to start today by making sure it's clear that I'm speaking for myself as a researcher who's been involved in the projects I'm about to talk about. I am not speaking as a representative of NASA or NASA employee. I will do my best to answer questions that relate to some of their stuff, but let's go ahead and put that caveat on all of it. I am not in the secret inner sanctum. I do not have, those magic answers for some of it, but I have the experiences of being one of the researchers that they pulled on board to work on these things. And it's been a real privilege to do so. And I'm excited to be able to talk to you guys about it. Now, our big starting spot, we're coming here is
Shannon, I'm sorry.
Yes.
We're not seeing your slides on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me. And I have one moment, please. I've lost my Zoom set. It's a pretty decent background for, just throwing around there. Is that coming through now?
Yes,
Perfect.
except it's just that. It's not the slide.
That's all right. It'll give me 1 second to get myself back there. We good now?
Yep.
All right. second time's the charm. Glad to have everybody online to actually see what I've got, because I've got pictures from these projects that we've been doing. So our history of space exploration, and we're coming back to Apollo. You know, we think about Apollo, we think about this really important time in history, in exploration, in just incredible achievements that were being done. And it's easy to think that it lasted a lot longer than it did. You know, the first Apollo mission to land on the moon, Apollo 11, first people on the moon, is 1969. The last is 1972. 1972 is the last time that we had humans from any nation set foot on the moon. Depending on how you feel about the passage of time, that's 8 years before I was born. And I am a full professor, right? I can pretend that I'm looking youthful, but it's been a hot minute. The technology has changed. What we understand about our ability to actually do the engineering for this, what we understand about the moon, about Mars, about space, about how people work together, about all of these things has evolved drastically. Now, since then, of course, we've had robots up there. We've had robots going around on the moon. We've had them on Mars. We've made huge leaps in that front. But, you know, we haven't actually had the people back. Now, we've had human spaceflight going since Apollo. We've had, you know, Skylab, got, you know, Apollo Soyuz gets us to 75, Space Shuttle program ends 2011, Space Shuttle Mir, you know, ends 98. These are organized by when they start, not by when they end. And now we're moving into a whole new era of space exploration with the kickoff to the Artemis series. The Artemis, you know, sibling to Apollo, coming in, and this is ushering in an entirely new experience of what we're going to be doing for human spaceflight. We are changing the paradigms of what this will look like from what we've had in the past. Of all of these missions that have gone up, all of the people that have been in space, which we actually have hundreds of astronauts who have been to space, we've only had roughly 7 spacewalks or extravehicular activities that actually involved science. Almost all of them are engineering driven. And this is a really new opportunity to actually really embrace the exploration side of space exploration. Now, sometimes people think, well, we're really good at robots now. You know, back when we were doing Apollo, it really wasn't viable for us to put up a remote control car on the moon and let it do its thing. We can do that now. Why would we actually put people back up there, risk human lives? Because NASA is very, very serious about protecting the lives of the people that are involved. There's a zero tolerance policy. Everybody's in this for collective safety. But the human factor is actually really, really important. And that's not a thing that even with the advancements in AI that we have, you know, in ChatGPT and me reading term papers real closely, notwithstanding, we've got so much that we haven't actually captured. An example of this, in Apollo 15, Mission Commander David Scott collected the famous seatbelt basalt. Can I see hands? Does anybody have any idea what I'm talking about? All right. So when you are an astronaut with NASA, even now, but especially so with the Apollo missions, you don't just get to like wander around, do those weird little like low gravity bunny hops. You don't just like let you wander and do your thing. It is incredibly crafted. It is down to the minute. You will do this, you will do that. We will actually practice all of these actions in advance. We will not deviate from plan unless it's about safety. So Commander David Scott is out there in the little rover vehicle. They're driving around in Apollo 15. And he and his partner see a rock that looks different. And despite the fact that they're not geologists, we've only ever had one scientist land on the moon. Not a geologist, but he's received solid geology training, and he knows that this rock being different is meaningful. This could start to answer some of these open questions that we have. This is a thing that's worth having. The problem is they're already in that little rover and they're not authorized to pick up any rocks right now. So it turns out putting on his full, I'm a vaguely misbehaving astronaut scientist cap, and we don't have any lifetime video coming back from this. This was not an option at the time. He and his partner start to put on a verbal play for the sake of mission control. Suddenly, David Scott's seatbelt doesn't seem to be fastening correctly. This necessitates a required stop of the vehicle. And the two of them spend this time talking back and forth on an open broadcast channel about how they're fiddling with his seatbelt, trying to get it work. Well, Commander Scott has literally gotten out of the vehicle, walked over, picked up the rock, turned around, put it back on the floorboards, gotten back in, and his seatbelt is suddenly great. And they drive back, but now he's got this sample that we otherwise wouldn't have had. And when we put something up with just robots, we lose, again, a lot of that ability to see that, to be able to have that human factor of, no, there's something funny here. And I can actually figure it out pretty quick, whether it's actually funny or if it's just like a weird lighting angle. I'm not going to have to drive a robot in circles and deviate from the plan that's very carefully crafted, to be able to evaluate that and use that training and that synthesis of knowledge to be able to make these decisions that can bring us back really interesting information. So as we're moving forward, as we're returning to the moon, it's essential that we're actually pulling that in. We're pulling in the knowledge that we have and these ways of exploring and creating more freedom for these astronauts, no matter how much that terrifies us as the people that are on Earth. We're guiding them and telling them what to do. So Artemis 3, hopefully 2026. There's honestly been some sliding deadlines I've experienced with NASA post-pandemic. We're still going through the reverberations of that and supply chains and putting things together. This is an artist's rendition of the actual lander that's selected. If you look closely here, you will see the two little astronauts. Oh yeah, they're little guys. This is actually an external elevator that will get them up. Here's actually the door up here. And see where we've got the flag and we've got some of the boxes around there to be able to grab stuff. This is going to be going to the South Pole of the moon. It's going to be going to an area in which we have permanently shadowed regions, or PSR. These are areas where the actual shape of the land, the craters, means that with a low angle sunlight that comes in, they have never ever seen daylight. Without any daylight there and without any atmosphere to help move that warmth around, that means that in these permanently shadowed regions, we think that we essentially have these ice sinks. We're actually developing and growing ice pooled in these spaces, including, we call them fairy castle structures. They're growing up as molecular volatiles, water and other gases, sort of bop around, get trapped in one of those, and essentially can never escape. And we're very interested in these gases, these volatiles, and these ice traps, because they potentially do supply a lot of fuel that would help us in the continuing expeditions to Mars. We're not talking about harvesting water from the moon, so that way we can bring it back to Earth and drink it. I'm sure some billionaire will try to achieve that, with like their one glass of the world's most expensive water. I don't know. But we're not talking about it as like bring the water to Earth. Talking about bring the water as what we're going to use in the reactions to help get us the rest of the way to Mars and be able to use this as in situ resources for communities that would potentially have like a base there to be able to actually build. But this is a really big deal that we're going to be going there. It's going to be very low angle light. It's going to be wildly disorienting. And we have to figure out, how do we actually enable the astronauts to do this? How do we enable the science team on Earth to provide support within the limited structure available through all of those mission control loops? We don't just have an open channel between a science room on Earth and the astronauts walking around. They don't need us chirping in their ears. The higher priority after they've got that training is all of the safety stuff. But they're still, as a partnership up there, going to be carrying the weight of the scientific community for multiple nations. This is a big effort. This is not even just the US. Multiple nations involved carrying that weight need to pick up the right rocks. They will have very limited mass that they are able to bring back. They have to pick the right ones. The first rock is obviously going to be amazing. It's going to be perfect. We're going to love that first rock. But if you bring the same rock back over and over, the fifth one is a paperweight. You just lost the scientific value you could have had depending on how you're approaching this. And so we need to be able to have the science team on Earth available to answer their questions and to be offering this sort of guidance to them to be able to support these astronauts. So that brings us to Jet 3. So the Joint EVA test team that started doing simulations a year ago. The Jet 3 team was made up of a group of scientists from across the US who were brought on to draft a simulated mission to the moon, a practice version of Artemis 3 in this part of the Arizona desert. This is actually an aerial photo of the area that we were given. It was down resolved to be at the same resolution of the imagery that we have for the moon. And we had to start with, well, what do we care about knowing? What are our science questions? How do we organize that into samples? What would we actually need? What sort of observations or photos? What do we need to get there? And what are the rules of engagement for the astronauts who are going to be doing it? Built that up over several months, trained astronauts. They literally just threw 2 astronauts in with us. They put them through a very intensive one-day geology training. If you can imagine a whole group of scientists trying to shove all of their specialties into astronaut brains in one very, very long telecon, you can have a little bit of sympathy for these poor astronauts. They were great sports about it. But rapid fire training, preparing, and then we sent them out to do this. Now, it's a little bit closer than the moon, just a touch. All of us during the mission were actually serving in Johnson Space Center in Houston. We were in one, we were set up with the actual rooms. We were not like displacing the group that's doing the support for the space station, but we were in that building and associated buildings. We had the comms loops using the exact same systems. We had actual flight directors, actual flight controllers, actual astronaut oversight specialists. Some of them were running from various playbooks where they would just start like arguing that, oh, it looks like we're having a low battery on XYZ. And science's job was to just fight for science. Do what we could to support those astronauts, no matter what was going on, to enable their science. While those astronauts were out in the field in the middle of the night. So one of the questions would be like, well, why on earth are we doing this in the middle of the night? It's not that hot in Arizona, especially in the fall. And the issue is that when we go to the south pole of the moon, we're going to have very, very disorienting low angle light where it's going to be the sun hanging right on the horizon and you turn the wrong way and you're blind. And you get in the shadow of something and it's somewhere that might have never, ever seen light since the moon essentially was there. And so the topography was created to create that shadow. So we need to try to create this alien landscape. So we're in an area with some similar volcanoes, some similar sort of structures and hills. And there's a team of people chasing the astronauts with floodlights, always standing on the same side of them, so that way they can't turn in that direction because they go blind in that direction, but giving that same weird view that limits what they can see. Our missions, we ran 4 of them, all starting from the same sort of lander position. And we, on our duty stations, needed to be there and checked in no later than 2 p.m. And we did not get released to stumble back to our hotel rooms until between 2 and 5 a.m. And then those of us who were professors got to record our lectures for class. I was getting a little zombie-ish by the end, no lies. But we're doing all of this to be able to support that team that's out there as they're tackling hypotheses and objectives related to volcanology, surface processes, tectonics, and age relationships. Now, not all of those objectives are going to be key objectives for the moon. On the moon, we're not particularly involved with surface processes. We don't have an atmosphere. We're not going to have dunes. We're not having that blowing around. We get regolith, which is all of the rock fragment dust that covers everything that happens after we have impact events that crushes the stuff and it snows back down. But that's not one of the priorities in the same way that that would be if we're talking about somewhere like Mars, where we actually have some atmosphere that's going to move stuff around. And that becomes a very interesting question again. Similarly, we don't have tectonics on the moon, but we can be looking at on a more micro scale. Are we seeing flexures in the ground, sort of fissures, eruptions, sort of things that are part of that sort of system, that sort of stuff we could potentially see, just not tectonics and the plate tectonics sorts of scales. We care about the age relationships, like what came first, what came second. Can I even tell what my units are, or is everything just sort of a dusty landscape? Now, as part of our training with this, the science backroom team, was in mission control. We had to go through all of the training. We spent time getting training on how to actually use the official loops that they use, that's what they call, to be able to communicate between the different desks. This is actually us in the active mission control. You can see all of us there are just 100% fangirling out, taking photos. This is on the floor of active mission control while they were currently supporting space station work. So what you can't see is the other side outside of the frame are all the people at the desks actively supporting astronauts who are doing work on the space station. And we're there geeking out on the actual floor. They let us in the spot you're not supposed to go. For me, it was also a real pleasure. I'm posing here with my former graduate student, Angela Garcia, who did her master's with me. And she wasn't on this project like I was as an outsider being brought in. She's actually on this team. After graduating from my lab, she now actually works at Johnson Space Center and is part of the team that's actually doing all of the prep for this and building all of this to be able to get ready for Artemis 3 and beyond. As we're going through the training for all of this, we also needed to understand what it's going to be like for the astronauts to the best of our ability. Our ability to work across that space gap is fundamentally based on our ability to empathize with what's happening on the other side.
Okay.
And you're not going to be able to take us in mission control and actually put us in reduced gravity and make us frustrated with trying to figure out how to break a rock in a space suit.
Wonderful.
But you can do things like put us in virtual reality and have us fumbling around through actions, where in this case, you can see the screen to the side over her shoulder. You actually can see her in the weird low angle light trying to figure out how to pick up something off of the ground using digital versions of the actual tools. What's actually possible? How is the gravity going to work? Starting to get an initial sense for that. They also let us play with the gloves. So, put us in, this is actually in a vacuum chamber right there that my hands are in, trying to actually, in a real sick twist, they gave us Rubik's Cubes. If you want to make a point, right? Like, give us a Rubik's Cube. These gloves are not easy to work with. I was expecting, though, that they were going to be a lot worse. You're talking about something that's actually pressurized from the inside. This is essentially a giant air balloon that you're inside of. It's rubberized. The harder part is where the joints are. So here, and another one that's around here that you can't see through sort of the fabricing, the joints on these are not lined up with where you actually have the joints in your arms. And the reason for that is because as you're moving, we need to not actually be creating too much of a tension spot in an area that we could actually blow a seam. These things will leak. We need to make sure that leak is never faster than the air that we're pumping in. We need to keep them very stable. When we're working on the moon, moon dust is incredibly abrasive because it's stuff that we get from impacts into the rock with other things. This doesn't have an atmosphere. It never blows around. It never rounds. It will never smooth out. It is very abrasive. So this has to be bomb-proof, essentially. So in this bomb-proof thing, very heavy duty, the joints are all feeling like they're in the wrong places. It's actually very common for astronauts to return from spacewalks deeply bruised. It limits your range of motion. You can't do all the things you want to do. And that's even just talking about your arms. It obviously gets way more complicated when we talk about full body movements. You're not going to be able to do all of the stuff that you want. So it doesn't matter how much the science team says, just pick up the rock, if that's not going to happen because of the limitations of the suit. There is no getting around how some of these work, even with having these gloves going through extensive fitting processes. So having this sort of information and armed with our sort of overarching 4 goals are, we had to build 4 EVAs or extravehicular activities. So essentially 4 spacewalks. 2 of them were 4 hours long, 2 of them were 6 hours long. We got one rest day in the middle. That was all the time that we or the astronauts were going to have to recover and to wildly replan if anything had gone terribly wrong. Which, pro tip, everything goes terribly wrong. Something will always go wrong. The astronauts had to stay within about 50 meters of each other. So they didn't have to be right next to each other, but you couldn't really fully separate them to work on independent tasks. They needed to be close enough to be able to do co-support. Sometimes they actually had to work together. If they were going to do a core of sediment, which would be able to, how we'd extract the ice, that actually is a two-person job. So you'd have to decide what task wasn't going to happen to enable that task to happen, having them work together on it. We had to count every gram that goes up or down. Part of the plan right now is to be able to get back 100 kilograms worth of sample. That's including the stuff it's packaged in. We're going to have to leave behind the tools we bring up. It's an exchange rate. The return vehicle, I mean, it looks like that really, really big lander canister thing. That's not the whole thing that's actually making it back down to Earth. It's actually a very, very cramped, small space. Everything has to fit in a very, very small space. We had to be paying attention to the volumes, and we had to be paying attention to the mass. And if you wanted a fancy sample, fancy samples require extra packaging. You know, you needed to know whether you were just picking up a rock that you could essentially put into just a simple bag, or if it was one that was going to require that it was going to be airtight. And it would have to have multiple fail safes on it to ensure that if it was a volatile sample, none of those volatiles would be able to escape, even as it warmed up and it went from being ice to liquid or gas. So none of it could get out. Nothing could be interfering with the people on the way back or get mixed into other samples. We were only allowed to send one very long email to the astronauts each day. You know, we'd have prepped them. They had the plan for each day well in advance. But if things needed to change, we got one very detailed email and then a brief phone call where they could ask any panicked questions at the last minute to figure out, you know, page 37, bullet 3, what exactly do you mean here? So we had to be extraordinarily careful about how we're doing this. Now, part of that's because you don't just change plans on astronauts. They have prepared for a thing. We're trying to enable their safety and their success scientifically. We can't just like freestyle it. Geologists, you know, on Earth here, I take my grad students out in the field. You know, we have a plan. But if we see the equivalent of a dinosaur bone in an unexpected spot, you better believe we change the plan, we chase that. You know, we actually talked about dinosaur bones as being the thing that when you find a dinosaur bone on the moon, you need a chance to chase it. And so we're trying to find these ways to build in and enable that flexibility and that discovery and that exploration. But at the same time, we have to give them something that's well crafted, that gives them the guidance, that gives them how they're going to get to the places, that doesn't leave them hanging. And with all that, we just sort of turn them loose and hope that they can do as much as they can while we were watching live time from mission control at consoles, trying to track their progress, figure out what's actually going on, and support them with any questions that they have. But every time they ask a question, it's going to take us passing it through a game of telephone through multiple other officers in the structure before it gets back to them. And let me tell you, one of the things we learned is that we needed to have put all of them through the brutal geology training too, because the astronauts asked a question that made sense. We gave them an answer that made sense, and the answer that got to the astronaut no longer made sense. And that can be a real challenge. If you've ever played, you know, that whispers game or telephone game where you start with one thing and it passes around, one small change in a word can absolutely change the meaning of what you're talking about when you're dealing with stuff that's got very technical language around it, even if you've tried to simplify it down. So this is the map of what we had planned. 4 different EVAs. We started with blue, then yellow, then green, then purple. The individual spots on there are color-coded based off of how desperately we wanted the data from that spot. Our #1 location of anywhere was M1, but we found out shortly before we arrived, we were not going to get it all. And so we had to create M1B as a backup plan. You know, but we've got anything that's in green, super high priority, followed by yellow, then red, and blue is sort of nice to have. The points on this map were generated by having our science team broken into different groups based off of our themes and put spots on map. Where would you actually get the data that you need? Where are you going to get the answers to the questions that you want? And then where can we get the spot that gets us the most answers that we possibly can? So rather than saying, hey, I'm team volcanology, I get pride of place, we're going to win, we're going to focus on that and just sort of like do what we can with other things as we go. Instead, it's, well, M1 is going to give us answers to volcanology and age relationships and tectonics and said strat. That's our top pick. And so trying to find those and find where they sort of clustered in space and find a spot that would be mutually agreeable. Now, this turns out to be a very aggressive plan. We were given how many minutes, we were told how fast they could walk, we were told how many minutes each activity was, we had it all down to the minute. Spoilers, it does not go in our favor. Because as I've been harping on already, science is more complicated than that, and exploration is more complicated than that. The astronauts are wearing these suits. And we had to wear them for the first 2 EVAs. These are Atlas suits. These are 2 actual astronauts. Zena on the left, I've had the pleasure of getting to work with on multiple projects before. I actually was working with her on a project before she was ever selected as an astronaut. So it was really exciting to get to work with her again as like a real live astronaut now, as opposed to she's on one of our past projects where her job essentially was carry the heavy things. And she did it with a sort of grace and like enthusiasm. Like, yeah, this is the person who's going to grow up to be an astronaut. Like this is a team player. But they're wearing these suits to mimic some of the restrictions on their movement. You can see those long shoulder braces coming down. You can see where their sort of legs are sticking out from there. It's going to make it harder for them to move. They have limited view side to side. Their headpieces there have lights to be able to help. Inside of that suit, there's actually an interior harness system to be able to accommodate the weight, to distribute that. So it's not just resting on shoulders, but these suits are easily 100 pounds. If that harness gets out of alignment, it very quickly becomes untenable. It becomes awful. And you can see from the background, most of what we've got right there is just grass. But I want you to also envision that they're about to have to start walking up hills in the dark through sagebrush. And these suits are going to really, really add to the time it takes to do that and limit their ability to move. And if any of you have ever spent time on crutches or something like that, you can also appreciate that that sort of mobility adjustment doesn't just affect your ability to physically get around, it changes your ability to be thinking about what you're doing too, because you're having to spend a lot of energy on the physical act of moving, on dealing with the discomfort that you're undergoing, and you cannot actually engage your brain in the same way. So these become limiting factors. They're also working in the dark. So they've got, depending on where they are, that flood lamp from one direction. If they go on the wrong side of a rock, the flood lamp disappears. And all they're left with are just the lights on their suits themselves to be able to help them navigate. This is a real challenge. You can't really tell where you are. It is wildly disorienting for trying to navigate. And it's further complicated that on the moon, we don't have GPS. So as they're doing this, they cannot even track their position using, say, a GPS log that's going to give them a lifetime tracker on their arm. What they actually have are paper printed maps that have alphanumeric grids on them that they have to physically pull out from this little cart over here that they're dragging around across the ground. And they pull it out and they try to dead reckon their location based off of the things that they've seen around them. On the moon, that would be counting craters that they walk past and call out their alphanumeric grid position, which is an enormous challenge to be able to know exactly where you are, especially when you lack a lot of this broader consistency. The closest we had the big spotlights representing the sun. And we had actually, this is actually the service tent, but we did have a big inflatable glowing earth set up. So that way they could, have that as also a reference point, this big inflatable, planet Earth to help them again with their orientation, but you got to be at the right angle to be able to see it. So supporting them in this, we've got multiple jobs from the science evaluation room. This is the team that's in Johnson Space Center. We have science leads, science communicator, theme leads in different topics, astronaut position correction, because you better believe they're wrong more often than they're right when they're trying to call out where they are, because while they do need to know where they are, they're not often getting it right at the time. So this person is literally, their job is to be watching the video camera coming back down from that person's suit, trying to correct the location. We've got listing play-by-play, what's happening, note-taking, samples, cataloging photos as they come in. All of this to be able to enable us that the moment they ask us a question, we have an answer. And that when we get to the end of that day, we know exactly what we have, we know exactly what we lost, and we know anything that we need to edit for the following day. You know, when they were setting this up, one of their big questions that NASA had was, how do you get these people to work together? How do you do this? Because we're not expecting to bring in expert scientists to all come in and pretend that they are fully trained console people that would have in like a regular mission control, you know, flight controllers, where they're head down, they only look at one thing. This is their computer. They are worried about this exact thing. They only have to report out about that one thing. We're trying to build a synthesis. So originally they had us designed in a space that was a lot like a regular flight control room with all of us separately. They wanted us only talking to each other around the room over these little loops. You'd have to do a press to talk to the person next to you, even though they were 5 feet away, to be able to do all of this. Have you guys met enough scientists to already see the flaws here? Like, I mean, maybe there are some scientists who are better behaved than us, but this is a geology group. Y'all know that this is not how we play. To the utter horror of the people who were trying to do this, they could manage it and see how we used the software and how we communicated. We immediately started moving the tables around, stripped other rooms in the building for parts and pieces. I think we stole a television to like mount in the room. We definitely cleared out every sticky note they had ever had in their lives. We rejected the software that they had custom built to support the mission because it didn't allow us to live time update with shared screens. We're like, well, this is useless. We went to Kinko's, printed out giant maps, started layering them on tables in the middle, declared the middle a science scrum where, you know, this is where like theme leads would go to argue it out. We got ourselves little toys we could use to move around, like a war room style. Created the trench, was there anybody who was getting info straight from the astronauts to be able to log stuff, but now be part of the discussion. Sort of they received the info and could feed it to the rest of the room. Screens everywhere. You know, Sci Lead and SciComm off to one side so they could sort of observe what's going on. They're the only people allowed to speak to anybody outside the room anyway. Position tracking, that poor person had no idea what was going on with any of the discussions because it took 150% of their attention to just figure out where that astronaut actually was. The astronaut would be like, I've got a boulder. And we're like, there are no boulders where you said you were. Let's figure out where you actually are. Or they'd be walking across the plane. They're like, I don't know where I am. We're like, neither do we. Yeah, but we figured out things like they could take a camera. We had their cameras they had in their hands set for 3 levels of exposure every time they pressed to take the photo. And for the really low level one, they could hold that image in front of their chest camera and we could see it enough to figure out what they were looking at. Though even though their eyes and the video cameras couldn't see the landscape, we could pick it up if they held real still while they took that photo. And we could use that to start figuring out their locations, placing them around. So we rejected a lot of what they were trying to get us to do. And it's possible some of that will come back, but they've got a team that they'll have for multi-years. But this is sort of what it actually looked like. Screens up all around, people standing in the middle, things started being shouted. We were constantly being told we were too loud. They had to put us in a removed space. You can't see it through the extra screens, but over here along this wall, our group got known. We were infamous for being the group that had all the best snacks. Because we have all of these flight controllers, flight directors, everybody else is actually still working this middle of the night shift with us. But for them, it was just more like a business as usual. And we're like, well, no, this is not how we work. Get the treats. Snacks is how science happens. Snacks are essential. So we'd have this buffet. People would be sneaking up out of other parts of mission control to raid our snack tables. And we'd kick them back out because now they were too loud. Darn it. The science scrum itself, having all of these out, at first we were trying to do this, we were trying to figure out how we could label stuff on there. You can see actually the origins right there starting to creep up. The Post-it notes right there. The little, anybody here remember micro machines from the 1980s? It was like the mini race car, like toy car things. One of our team members actually had space-themed ones from his childhood that we brought in and we used to be able to track their positions around and be able to argue out what we needed, where things were. We had big screens to show us what was happening in any given moment. You could look over, see all of these things color-coded based off of activity, how much time we had elapsed for different tasks, what was going on, and be able to quickly scroll back if we had any questions that we needed. Obviously, we're very, very serious about keeping ourselves on the floor. We're crawling on tables, we're crawling on chairs, we're trying to get better views of things. I'm fairly certain the engineers at this point started to consider us basically the monkey cage. Like we were the monkey pit at the zoo, but the monkeys were driving. We were the ones who were coming up with the plans, and we were the ones who were answering all those key questions as we chased our little astronaut figurines around this map and turned it into absolute Post-it pandemonium. We decided the regular Post-its were too big, they were clumsy. We started slicing them up into really small things, labeling them, color coding them from different stuff, being able to track what's going on, what's an observation, what's a hypothesis, what's the thing that we need to go back to, what's the thing that will never be seen again, what's the thing that we accidentally dropped something and we should probably make sure somebody from the safety team goes and picks it up later. All of the things, all of the annotations coming in these color-coded Post-its, because spatial problems require spatial solutions. And the original software that was designed to enable us assumed that you only cared about what you personally cared about, not that you were working as a team, as a holistic group of scientists to actually get answers. And so you wouldn't be able to see what everyone else was doing. You wouldn't be able to synthesize all of it together. It was not live time updating. And I don't care if you've got 10 people all taking separate notes. If they spend their entire time taking the notes to put them on the map, then you've lost all the time for them to be thinking and conferring and arguing and brainstorming and actually getting to the juicy bits of the science that's going to enable it to evolve and make a difference. That's going to make it so much better than just having a robot on a pre-programmed mission go and do a thing. So we can actually be able to articulate this and get that back up. So let's come back to this planned map. Remember, this was our beautiful view. We had it all mapped out down to the minute. We knew exactly how long every single activity was going to take, how long it was going to take to walk between locations. We had like 15 minutes bonus on each one. It was going to be great. So this is what it looked like. See on that first one right here, the blue one, we never even made it to the first spot. They're wearing those big suits. They got stuck in the sagebrush. The harnesses were not fitting properly. One of the astronauts just kept describing it as untenable, but she was the one that was still walking. The other one, they had to keep pulling out a weight bench to be able to set up so that way he could get on it, so they could try and take the weight off of it. We're trying to fix all of his fittings because they couldn't ever find where they were. We couldn't also figure out. We knew that they occasionally saw a rock. So at some point in there, we said, give up on the plan. Find rock. We'll worry about the rest later. Just find us a thing. Anything that's not dust or sagebrush, find us thing. And they worked really, really hard to do that. On the next one, they're still wearing those awful suits, which at this point, science backroom, mission control is essentially begging to have them released because of the fit issues. We think something just got off in it. Can we take them out of it? This is just, it's rough. They were required to do 2 days in them. So that second day, they start from this position. M6 was our lander, supposed to come down here, make it all the way to M8, come back out, hit here and go back. They started announcing they thought they'd hit M8 somewhere around here. They were not getting close at all. Nobody really from our team cared that much about M8. It wasn't that high of a priority. So we all started trying to lobby for, what if we just lie and tell them they found it? Because when you have to tell them that they've been working that hard, even going up something like right here, that straight line, this is a gully. They can't even deviate to the left or right. They can't get lost. They can count the grooves of things coming in past them, and they can actually, this is their best shot at signposts along the way, and they still can't actually track it because of the physical strain that they are under and the weird lighting conditions. You know, we got them pretty far in, but we absolutely could not actually hit M25. That was a loss. We ended up actually recovering that on the 4th EVA. But these first 2 EVAs, really told us that all of the estimates of speed were wrong. They were absolutely wrong. They're also spending so much time trying to find themselves that we were losing even more time on top of the fact that it was difficult to move in those Atlas suits. Now, they were able to take them off for the next ones, but if I go back here, you'll see that green one went way out to here. So in this one, you can see we literally just chopped all of that off when we had that one replan day and said, well, that's not going to happen now, is it? So let's lose that. Let's see what we can do to consolidate down. Also lost like a far point out of the purple one, trying to consolidate to see what we could still recover, what we could actually maintain. And without the suits on, they were much faster. They were able to move around a lot better. They became like bouncy again. They started finding bones and sending us pictures of like bones that they found out there. They found a skull, they found antlers, and they're wandering around with like antlers. So the joy came back when they're not carrying all of that, but we're still missing a lot of these things. We couldn't actually go to the original plan because of these limitations, because of being over optimistic about what they could actually do. And it's very plausible that the initial plans that we will have for them in Artemis 3 are similarly going to be over optimistic. We're not really going to know how fast that pair is going to go until they're doing it. We know what we think it should be. We know what slopes they should be able to handle and what they can do, but we're going to have to actually see it to see what actually shakes out, how long it's going to really take them in the full suit in reduced gravity to be able to chisel a rock off of a boulder. We've got all sorts of hopes and dreams about, oh, it's this many minutes, it's that many minutes. The reality is we're going to actually have to be very flexible in what happens. Overall, we had less than 50% success in what we were trying to do, because I think this is really the root of it. It's some of it we had too many cooks in the kitchen. We treated all 4 of our themes as the same level of priority. We had if every spot is important, and a location on the ground is only more important because it solves more people's problems than actually really solving one problem, we start to lose all of them. And we need to do a better job of editing our targets so we have really 1 or 2 things that are driving what we care about and do, and the rest of the things that are opportunistic wins along the way. We can't make everybody happy, and we need, even when we're carrying something that has the weight of a multinational space program, we have to internalize that, and we have to actually reflect that in the work that we do. It feels wasteful at some level. Like, no, we're going to the moon. We're going to do all of the things. And the problem is, if we try too hard to do all of the things, we in the end don't get the win on any of the things. And so we have to be more aggressive about how we take that down, how we do our prioritization all the way down to the objectives, not just prioritizing the field targets. We need to be able to have better ways to be able to replan. We need to really make sure that we're continuing to develop how this communication works. Within the science evaluation room, I think by rejecting a lot of the paradigms we inherited, we're able to get ourselves to a really good spot for that. But we still struggled sometimes with when we had to pass that message through the chain up the mission control structure to be able to get to the astronauts. At one point, when the astronauts got salty enough about getting what they considered to be nonsense responses, they finally were able to put a scientist on the line. But it took an astronaut getting pretty salty for that to happen. How do we improve that? How do we make sure that we actually have the right words, that we're developing the shared language that's going to enable all of this, to make sure we can get all of these layers working well? So the Jet 5 follow-on is in progress right now. They were supposed to do their field campaign this fall. There was the risk of the government shutdown this fall. So in the end, they had to pivot and they were delayed until spring. That's giving them a lot more time to finish dialing some of this in, to be able to argue more about some of the training, closing the loops on some of that. I know for some of them it's quite stressful because it's adding a lot more work, because these are really sort of short, aggressive burst things, but it's also going to be feeding them in the end. The Artemis 3 geology team has already been selected. We don't know who the astronauts are yet, but we know who's going to be in mission control. We know who's going to be in that science evaluation room. They're already starting the process. They will be on console receiving training as soon as next month. And we don't expect that launch to go until 2026, possibly the year after. So that's giving them a lot more time. Now they've got the challenge that we won't actually know the landing location of Artemis 3 essentially until it happens, right? Last I heard, there were 13 contending locations. They're hoping to get it down to 7 that this group will actually have to plan for and design for. Because what happens is if we get bad weather, we can't launch on the day that's originally intended. Now our landing ellipse has changed. The lighting conditions have shifted. We can't go to that same spot. It might no longer be the best spot. So we need to have an entirely different plan that we pull out of that cupboard, ready to go with the same degree of science fidelity, the same expectations, that we can have everybody fully trained to do this massive pivot on. So they're already working on building those plans in preparation for Artemis 3 going up in 2026, humans returning to the moon. Whole new paradigm, lots of ability to stumble on the way. But we're doing all of the work that we can right now to make sure that we do all of that stumbling in full gravity here on Earth. So that way, when we actually have that team on the moon, we've got that team in Houston providing the sort of support that Apollo didn't have. Everything is going to be smooth sailing because we will have gone ahead and done all of our falls right here and learned the lessons that we need. Things like this are being rolled into that plan to support these astronauts. So thank you very much. And I'd love to answer any questions that you have. Thinking stumbling, I was regretting as soon as I started talking that I'd pulled that up to make sure I had a charge spot. I'm like, I'm going to put a foot in there. I'm going to break an ankle. Yeah. The intent is 2. Yeah, all of the plans so far are designed for there to be 2 astronauts out there at a time. They'll have similar rules for distance they're allowed to be separated by. The plans mostly involve them working in parallel. So they're actually working on different things in proximity to each other, but do occasionally actually have to partner up.
Would it be possible to give them some motorized transportation?
For Artemis 3, no. So in the future, yes. So in the future, we should be able to have motorized transportation in the same way that we did for Apollo. Operations designs for that also would have that be a vehicle that turns into a rover when the people aren't there. So it would be drivable on site by the astronauts, or then as you leave, you flip the switch and it becomes a remote control car for them to be able to prep the next landing site with high-res data. I thought that was for us for a second. Yeah.
So you talked about Jet 3, you just said Jet 5 is going on. I presume it's a Jet 4.
Sort of.
That worked on trying to improve what happened out of Jet 3.
Yeah, Jet 4 was a really small group. It didn't have a full backroom team. Mission Control Jets 1 and 2 were basically one person in a truck. Like Jet 2 happened in Iceland and all of the gear blew away when they had a bad storm roll through. And they spent most of the time in a truck desperately chasing it and trying to like rebuild their stuff. So like Jet 1 and 2, very, very lightweight, just a couple like full-time NASA employees. I don't think for like Jet 1, I don't think they had astronauts. I think they actually had like a grad student just walk around outside in the backyard at Johnson Space Center. Jet 4 in between was another lightweight one where they worked on just trying to refine a couple of very targeted things that came up as problems from this. But the big problems we found weren't things that would be solved with that sort of small group. That's why they've got to make sure they've got the big groups back in. Mm-hmm.
So if you have 3 or 4 people discussing something and trying to figure out which way to go, do you have somebody designated as the decider after the people that have already discussed it?
So you're telling me you've got plenty of experience as a scientist. Yes. So within the science evaluation room, we do have a science lead, and that person's job is to be referee, umpire, like make the final decisions of what's coming out. And the idea is that we're really trying hard to be generating consensus as opposed to actually having it. You have to have a third person make the call. And sometimes that consensus, one of the challenges that comes up in there is what is the force of personality of any one person? How comfortable are they? Have you actually established a rapport in which there's, academic, professional, intellectual safety, and just being, that's a stupid idea. Yeah, obviously we don't call each other stupid, but occasionally there's a moment we're like, let's finish thinking that one through. None of us has slept in 3 days. So, you know, but to be able to do that and to make sure that we actually come out. But we do have a PSI lead whose job is to be the final decision maker. And the PSI lead is the only person allowed to speak to the PSI communicator, who's the only person allowed to pass the message out of the room.
I assume at the snack table, since it was NASA,
No beer, no beer, but we definitely would pick them up on our way home. And we were the only people on the hotel porch at 5 a.m. at the end of our shift cracking a beer.
But the resolution you were talking about, was that based on LRO?
So we've got some stuff that's better also than LRO. We've got LRO. For some of it, we've also sorry, I'm switching. That's our good visual. I was thinking like the elevation for a second, which is Lola. Lola is rougher than that. So we've also been able to build some higher res interpreted terrains based off of LRO, and some of that to be able to try to do better than what Lola can do for the terrain mapping. But we're still talking about, you know, for the actual imagery type stuff, somewhere around like a meter a pixel sort of thing, which, I mean, it's another planet. It's a whole lot better than we've got for the ocean floor. Yeah, but it's still a challenge for trying to really see what you've got going on there. And when you're talking about like big boulders that you essentially can't see because they're kind of hanging out at your resolution. It's going to be a real difference between what they've prepped in the VR and what they're actually going to face in reality.
So besides moon ice, what else do you hope to bring back?
So we're also wanting to bring back actual rocks. So the moon was formed.
Specific elements or
We're just trying to understand what all is going on. Yeah, so we've got a bunch of hypotheses about sort of the formation of the moon, its cooling, the changes in bombardment that happened in the time since then, different chemical provinces that exist. We're trying to be able to answer a lot of those questions to the best of our ability. The actual NASA list of questions that they would like to target with Artemis is over 10 pages long. And it's divided into these different categories. Not all of them are really enableable with this. Some of them are going to be actually, frankly, better handled by robots. So when we do the Viper mission that goes up next fall, that one is actually going to have a meter-long drill on it. It's a robot that will actually drill down, and it's carrying spectrometers. So it'll actually be able to return chemical signatures of the gases, any of the volatiles that are sort of trapped in there. It'll actually can use its own belly pan to warm up the ice, so that way it can pick it up with its mass spectrometers. That's going to be giving us a different sort of view where we can actually get, there's only data that comes back from that, but this one to be able to actually get the physical samples back. And I anticipate that the final plan for Artemis 3 is going to be informed by the results that we get back from Viper. They'll actually be used to sort of refine the actual targets. And, you know, it's not going to be the same physical space, but analogous spaces a little bit over in the south pole of the moon for like, okay, this turned out to be a real weirdo. We got to get something that looks like this. But we're looking for small rocks on the surface. We're looking for big boulder fields where we can ship off pieces and be able to see stuff that was locally excavated. The ejecta is literally bringing stuff up from the interior, essentially. The volcanoes are bringing stuff up from the interior. So it gives us a way to go through the deep geologic history of the moon by extracting the things that have been brought to surface. Yeah.
Got a three-part question here. Were you able to actually hear the questions that the astronauts were sending back when they wanted some clarification or instructions? That's the first part. Second part is was there a lag then, a simulated lag between when you heard them and then when they could actually get your answer? And the third part of that is, were you able to listen in as you heard your answer going through the chains of command and then realizing that, oh my gosh, this is not what we meant at all because they've changed this word to that word?
Yes, so we could hear them live time. because there was a full broadcast coming back with their suit cameras, and they were on open mic channels. And their open mic channels were broadcast just into our room. When we were rejecting all of the paradigms they gave us, we also rejected the earpieces. We're just like, that's nice. And so we just had it broadcast in for the entire room. There was no simulated addition of time between, for like a delay. For that, when we've done missions to Mars simulations, we've had to intentionally put that in. So in the Basalt analog project, that was the highest fidelity ever simulated mission to Mars. We did that in Idaho and Hawaii. That one, we actually had to control when that video would come into the mission control. It was delayed by anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. And then the reply out from mission control had another 5 to 15-minute delay. And there was 2 just study conditions, because those are both within scope of the orbital positions of where Earth and Mars could be. They can range anywhere from 4 to 22 light minutes apart. And so one of the questions for that was, can we only do this work when we're within a certain number of light minutes from Mars? When we're beyond that, is it completely untenable to be able to do the support? Weirdly enough, for that one, we found the scientists, everybody preferred 15 minutes to 5 minutes. They liked the worst condition. The moon, we're talking about having potentially a delay on the order of like 2 seconds. There'll be probably a little bit of additional that will just creep in based off of having to go through signal relays. But functionally, that's not enough for us to spend the time actually like simulating that in, because as it was, we were getting it live time. We have to look at each other. We have to get an answer. Then we pass that answer through our Sci lead, who tells it to our SciComm, who passes it to a person who's a level above us, who gets it to another level. And they can't just say it directly in time. So if the person who is pretending that there is a battery issue on the lander is muttering into the loops right then, we have to wait for that. So we actually got in trouble multiple times. We got chastised by the flight director for taking too long to answer, even though we started setting up a stopwatch that showed that we were answering within 5 seconds of question. It would just take that long. Now, our person who was our SciComm, who would actually be the one who relayed it out, they could hear some more of those loops. They could turn them on or off to hear what was actually being passed along. Problem is, there's so many different parts of chatter that are going through. Unless you're trained to be able to manage the competing chatter, it can be very, very difficult, because those people, like I might be speaking to you on one loop, you're speaking, to her on a different loop, but somebody else is listening to both conversations at the same time, just sort of keeping an eye on. We did have one member of our team who had actually had a first career as a flight controller for NASA. And so weirdly enough, we had him on the loops, because he'd literally gone through years of training and experience to be able to do that and manage that. Mostly we had to reduce some of those other loops. We couldn't always hear all the intermediate steps, but we could hear what they actually said to the astronauts. So we would hear what the main person at the very top said to the astronauts, and then we could hear the astronauts continue to talk back, because that line was kept open for us to all hear. But yeah, sometimes you would be like, how did they get that? Who are we hunting down right now? Who changed that word? And sometimes it's also you're being passed somebody else's words and you're having to wait 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. You start to lose the exact wording that it was.
I'd like to step in here for a moment. I hope everybody is still on Zoom and can hear me. I have been trying to run Zoom from the library, and my connection's been very unstable, and I have basically lost it. So if you had tried to chat to me with questions, please redo the questions in chat, and maybe best just to chat them to Shannon.
And I've got some,
Okay.
they're showing up right there.
I don't know how this, it's always something.
All right, so we got a question here. In terms of helping the astronauts know where they are without GPS, can a radar-like mechanism from the lander be of help? Absolutely. So during the Apollo missions, the later ones, we actually had a beacon. It went from the lander, and so it could give you a direction and approximate distance. I have my own hypotheses as to why we will not have that as the current plan is for Artemis 3. Right now, the design for it is because they're on foot and they've got a really, really tall lander. They can't go more than 2 kilometers out. There's a really hard cap on their allowed range. I think the perception was when the people were designing it, and this is again, me spitballing based on my experiences with it, it was not declared necessary for safety. And so it wasn't part of the engineering plan because they're going to find their way back. We're not going to lose them. They're not going to go behind a rock and get disoriented about which way to come back out. The problem is that we need it for science. And it was the sort of engineering and operations side when they told us that there was not going to be a tracking beacon like that. We lost our collective minds. And we were initially told, don't worry about it. Your science starts when the rocks come home. And no, all of us know that it matters where you picked it up. The spatial relationships are absolutely essential. So after we'd spent literally multiple weeks being really salty about this, some very, very heated discussions, we got done with that first EVA, the one where the astronauts got lost, couldn't find anywhere that they were actually aiming for. They were way down to those suits. We gather for our debrief at the end of that in this big, loading garage, loading deck space. And the person who'd previously told us the science didn't start until the samples came home, looked at the entire room and said, obviously we need to fix this. Somebody get me a better solution. So I have some hope. The problem is the time delay between when you can decide you want a thing and actually have it vetted for flight and installed and do that, because of the safety paradigm, this absolute we do not risk things perspective, which is essential if you're going to do space flight. You don't just throw a tracking beacon on. And so it sounds like it's still not going to be viable for Artemis 3 in the timeline that they have to be able to go through the procedures to do this. But for, say, Artemis 4 and beyond, this is something that we should be able to anticipate as a thing that we will actually have to be able to help enable this. We're also a team I'm leading right now out of Idaho State. We recently got a $750,000 grant from NASA using the volcanoes of the Eastern Snake River Plain as an analog for the moon in preparation for the various Artemis missions. And one of the things that we're also playing with is how to be able to do an automated location placement by just having photogrammetry, that if you just put on basically a passive double camera onto that little cart they're pushing, even before we get the rover, being able to use that to create point clouds of the surface that you're in and be able to overlay those using an automatic position location to the very low resolution pre-existing digital elevation map that you have, to be able to give yourself actual lock points, as opposed to, for this one, we had one person in science evaluation doing that manually, and somebody in another room that was in the EVA office doing it manually, and then arguing with each other about their own placements. We also, for this project we're going to have in Idaho for the next few years, we're going to be doing all of the work, wearing a GoPro, having a hidden GPS, and printed out map books with an alphanumeric grid that we're going to be having to call out our positions. Somebody later will review the tapes, trying to do position corrections for anything. And then later we can actually evaluate that against a time-stamped GPS track log, looking at where some of these greater vulnerabilities. We know, obviously, when you get a major feature, congrats, you found your spot. But how much of a drift are we getting, and what's triggering some of that drift when we've got those open spaces in between? And can we do some stuff to be able to mitigate that, to be able to help for that positioning when we don't have as strong a sense for that distance step? When I did geology in undergrad, they handed me a Brunton, some blank graph paper, and said, compass and paste, go to it, kid. Tie a flag on a tree branch. Here's your scale for the day, go map. And that's the thing that you learn how to do. You learn how to figure out how far is my pace, how far have I gone, what's my orientation. But when we take away sort of that regularity of the distance of your pace by putting you in reduced gravity where you're bunny hopping, and we take away that compass orientation, and we can have something where you're instead describing it as sun on my left shoulder. We start to lose some of that. So trying to figure out ways that we can better incorporate some of those things in there to be able to help with that. Yep. And it looks like the other ones were reminders from the audience that they cannot hear when you guys ask questions, and I should have been repeating those. I'm so sorry. Yes. You could, I mean, that's what we're using
You might
on
wanna
Viper.
repeat the question.
Oh, yes, yes, after I just said that, and I'm just jumping straight to answers. So the question is, could we use accelerometers in place of beacons to be able to help with some of that distancing? That's the thing that they would be able to install on the cart to be able to help. You're going to get a lot of like weird motion on the astronauts themselves. We are using a combination of accelerometers and wheel rotations on Viper to be able to help measure distances. But even that, we basically are doing an oversight where every so often when they do the pause, when it enters, say, night conditions and the rover goes to sleep for 14 days, they can actually do corrections in all of their positions to take what they were getting as sort of a rolling data collection and then shift it in space back to where they think it actually was. So that helps by a lot. It's a whole lot better than what we were dealing with here. Right now, again, that doesn't look like it's a thing that's on track to be included in Artemis 3, but could be part of that longer solution for future Artemis missions. Yeah.
Curiosity, the seatbelt rock, was that the anorthosite that they found?
So the question is if the seatbelt rock was the anorthosite. It is actually a basalt. At least why it's named a basalt. Part of what also makes it stand out is just how beautifully vesicular it is. In that picture, you can see all of those vesicles in there. You know, the seatbelt rock is an interesting piece to have. It did not, I think, answer really, really big questions. Like I think there was more hope that it would be possible for. But the point is we wouldn't have known that without collecting it anyway. But yeah, we definitely care about having the anorthosite versus like the low areas to be able to like, get the different compositions and their distributions. We've had a lot of satellite stuff that's returning better and better aerial geochemistry interpretations for what's going on. And some of the lunar meteorites that we've been able to analyze, stuff that's actually gotten kicked down to Earth for trying to look at possible, like basically thermal alteration situations that could have been happening in that early development as we're getting sort of the elemental separations in the formation of the moon. But we really want more of those rocks. And it's easier to, I'd say it's easier to go get them than it is to wait for them to fall. But
Geologic question.
yeah.
So if some billionaire wants to go out and claim of glory, can they blast this out and move the moon out of orbit and have it crash into the Earth?
All right. So the question is could a billionaire in a blaze of glory disrupt the orbit of the moon to actually knock it out of its current orbit? Fortunately, no. We can leave that to the Bond villains for right now. You know, one of our bigger concerns is as we're entering this new era of spaceflight, as this is going from being something that's really just held specifically by countries and like coalitions of countries, but we're getting more of private sector involvement. How is that actually working? We've got the CLIPS missions. Those are commercial lander payload programs that work with NASA that maybe they're going to you know, a billionaire's prep project or like a research programs thing that's not through an actual government, but then the government actually works like also like partnering with them and putting some sensors on there type thing. But one of our big risks is contamination and understanding how much contamination we have and where it is. As you're landing one of these things coming down, you're going to actually be having a jet wash that will actually be changing some of the volatiles. It's going to be sweeping stuff away. There's a lot of research going on as to what do we need to know about it? What's the actual radius of impact? That's actually one of the things that's within that list of questions for Artemis 3 to potentially be doing is within that 2-kilometer radius that they can do, can they actually make measurements of sort of the halo of wash that's coming out from that? You know, how is that going to influence future trips? Moon at least is sterile. There's no reason, none of us think there was actually critters that lived up there. By comparison, the Mars is a huge hot potato because it's very possible that we had microbial life there in the past. And so we have to be extraordinarily careful about when we put landers on there or when we actually do human missions. I said those suits leak. How do we make sure that we're not actually seeding the stuff that then we think we just found the evidence for? So there's actually an Office of Planetary Protection, which the first time you hear about that sounds like it should be getting ready for the movie Armageddon, you know, like protecting us from out there. It's really mostly about protecting out there from us. And so we've actually identified really, really key targets for astrobiology on Mars that we essentially have international agreements that nobody touches because none of us believe our science is good enough yet. And so we have to keep them pristine. We have to keep them protected until we can do better. In the same way that some of the Apollo samples only actually released to the public right before the pandemic. And by public, I mean researchers. They were literally brought back. Some were put out to research immediately, and some were basically just on lockdown for 50 years until it was deemed that the science had come enough that they could actually let people study them, because they were too worried about the destructive nature of some of our evaluation techniques. They didn't want to burn up the samples too quickly when our tools were going to be too rudimentary. So there's a lot of thought that goes into, you know, how to actually handle some of these things. What are the risks that we have from having, you know, a billionaire in a blaze of glory decides that this is what they want to do? What's that going to actually do to what we can actually study? So less about worried about moving the moon, more worried about moving the rocks on the moon and contaminating things that then are going to make science a lot more difficult globally.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shannon, very much. We actually have a small gift for you.
Thank you
There
so
you go.
much.
It was a pleasure to have you, and thank you again.
Oh, pleasure's mine. If you want to like come gossip with me afterwards about stuff, let's do it.
Okay. So we can, I'm not sure who was actually hosting because I was hosting and I can't get on Zoom anymore. So I'm just going to stop the share here. Okay. So if everybody would help with the chairs, that would be greatly appreciated. And thanks again for coming out.